I have been stationed on Verath for 11 years. I have watched 42 diplomatic gatherings pass through these corridors, ranging from minor trade arbitrations to one genuinely catastrophic treaty collapse that resulted in the evacuation of 3 decks and the arrest of a sitting ambassador. I am not easily surprised. I say this not to boast but to establish a baseline, because what I am about to describe surprised me deeply, and I want you to understand what that means coming from someone with my professional disposition. The Solaris Conclave was significant. It was, in fact, the most significant diplomatic event to be held in the neutral ring in roughly 3 centuries. 47 species, representing 11 different stellar empires, 2 independent confederacies, and the nascent galactic community framework, all converging on a single station to hammer out the terms of what would eventually become the Third Galactic Compact. The stakes were, and I am using this word with full awareness of its weight, civilizational. If the compact failed, 2 of the 11 stellar empires had already signaled through back-channel communications that they would pursue separate bilateral treaties with each other, effectively fracturing the community into competing blocks. 3 smaller species had privately indicated they would align with whichever bloc offered better trade terms. The whole delicate scaffolding of galactic cooperation, assembled over nearly 400 years of painstaking diplomacy, was teetering on the particular leverage point of this conclave. It was, in other words, not the moment for an incident. Verath Station had been prepared accordingly. Every corridor that the delegates would use had been resurfaced and relit. The atmospheric processors had been recalibrated to maintain a blend comfortable for the majority of attending species, which required a genuinely impressive amount of engineering work given the respiratory range involved. The catering teams had worked for 3 months to develop a menu that could be safely consumed by 31 of the 47 species without modification, and safely adapted for the remaining 16 with minimal ceremony. The security arrangements had been handled by the Galactic Diplomatic Corps' own protective detail, supplemented by a rotating honor guard drawn from member species as a gesture of institutional inclusivity. Humans had been offered 2 slots in that honor guard rotation, which was considered appropriate given their relatively recent admission to the community. Ambassador Vreth Nassali of the Vrethian Collective, the species chairing the conclave, as they had hosted it on their territory, had personally approved the guard rotation assignments. I have since spoken with Ambassador Nassali at length about her feelings regarding that decision. She told me, with characteristic dry humor, that she would have made exactly the same decision again. She also told me, and I am quoting her directly with her permission, that she had never in 412 years of diplomatic service felt so thoroughly outpaced by a subordinate. I should explain who that subordinate was. Part 2. The Guard. Testimony: Senior Attaché Murin Quass, Vrethian Collective Diplomatic Mission. My name is Murin Quass. I was Ambassador Nassali's senior attaché for 11 years before the incident, and I have remained in that role for 7 years since. I will probably die in this role, which is fine. Ambassador Nassali is not an easy person to work for, but she is an extraordinary one, and I consider it a privilege. I was the one who reviewed the guard assignments before the conclave. My job was to cross-reference the core list against our own security assessments, flag any personnel whose background presented concerns, and bring anything unusual to the ambassador's attention. It was a routine task. I had done it dozens of times. You look at the file, you look at the training record, you look at the species background profile, you note anything that needs noting, you sign off. I looked at the human guard's file, and I almost flagged it. His name was Corporal Davin Reese. He was 29 standard years old, which I had to convert twice because humans use a different year length, and I always forget the conversion factor. He had been in the Galactic Diplomatic Corps Protective Branch for 4 years. His training scores were excellent, top 5% in his cohort across most categories, though his scores in environmental tolerance assessment were listed as category maximum, cap applied, which I had never seen before and assumed was a data formatting error. His commendations were solid. No disciplinary record, fluent in standard galactic lingua franca and, curiously, 3 other alien languages, which was unusual for someone his age. The thing that made me almost flag his file was his planet of origin. I am Vrethian. Our homeworld is Vreth Prime, which is a mild, temperate planet with low predation pressure, no significant geological instability, and an atmosphere so agreeable that 3 other species have established colonies there simply because they like the air. We are not, by galactic standards, a species that has been hardened by our environment. We are, to be candid, a species that has been softened by it. Our evolutionary history is one of gradual, peaceful refinement. We developed intelligence and civilization in conditions that were, fundamentally, comfortable. When I looked at Corporal Reese's planet of origin, a small blue planet in the Sol system, 3rd from its star, called Earth, I was aware that it had a Deathworld classification, because all human homeworlds are required by community policy to carry that classification. But the classification is, in my professional experience, somewhat overused. Many planets earn Deathworld status simply by having a higher-than-average predation index or more variable weather patterns than the galactic median. I had escorted diplomats through assignments on 4 different Deathworlds and found them all perfectly manageable. I skimmed the environmental assessment summary that accompanied Reese's file. I did not read it in detail. This was my error, and I will own it without qualification. I signed off on his assignment. I passed his file to the ambassador with a routine clearance notation. She glanced at it, approved it, and moved on to the 17 other logistical concerns that were competing for her attention in the week before the conclave began. We met Corporal Reese for the first time on the morning of the opening day. He arrived at the ambassador's quarters at 600 station time as scheduled, in full corps dress uniform, dark gray with the gold diplomatic seal at the left breast, the rank stripe at the cuff, and introduced himself with a handshake. Vrethians don't use handshakes. He caught himself immediately, converted smoothly to the Vrethian formal greeting posture, and apologized for the reflex without making a production of it. Ambassador Nassali told me later that she had liked him immediately, which for her is not a small thing. She is not a warm person by nature. She appreciates efficiency and directness, and from the first moment, Corporal Reese had both. He was not what you would call visually imposing, if you were judging by galactic standards. He stood approximately 1.83 meters tall, which is average for a human male and unremarkable by most species measures. He was lean but not conspicuously muscled. His face was composed, not blank, not expressionless, but settled, like someone who has simply decided not to use more energy on their face than the situation requires. His eyes were a medium shade of brown and they moved constantly, cataloging, assessing, returning to the ambassador at regular intervals. Those eyes were the only thing that gave me any pause in that first meeting. Not unease, exactly. More like the feeling of encountering something that does not quite fit the category you have placed it in, and being unable to immediately identify why. I put it aside. We had a conclave to prepare for. Part 3, the station's heartbeat. Testimony Station Master Helic Duran, Verath Station Operations. I have run Verath Station for 16 years. Before that, I ran a smaller way station in the Bellin sector, and before that I was a navigation officer on a long-haul cargo freighter, and before that I was a young Helician with grand dreams of seeing the galaxy who had not yet learned that seeing the galaxy mostly involves a great deal of paperwork and atmospheric processor maintenance. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that I am a practical creature. I do not deal in abstractions. I deal in docking schedules, atmospheric blend complaints, catering logistics, and the perpetual structural anxiety of operating a station that was built 200 years ago by engineers who did not anticipate the modern traffic load. The conclave was, from an operational standpoint, the most demanding event of my career. I had 47 species delegations arriving over a 4-day window, each with their own environmental requirements, dietary constraints, security preferences, and in 3 cases, specific requirements about the color temperature of the lighting in their quarters. I had 312 core security personnel to house and coordinate. I had a press contingent of 47 journalists, one from each attending species, all of whom required separate briefing rooms and constant attention. I did not have time to notice individual guards, but I noticed Corporal Reese. I first saw him during the pre-conclave walkthrough, 2 days before the opening ceremony. He had requested a security tour of the reception hall, which was standard practice, and I had assigned one of my junior operations staff to accompany him. When I passed through the reception hall myself an hour later to check on the atmospheric calibration, I found Corporal Reese standing alone in the center of the hall, his back to me, completely still, staring at the ceiling. I asked my junior staff member, who was standing near the door looking slightly puzzled, what he was doing. She said, "I think he's memorizing it, sir." I looked at him for a moment. He did not move. He was standing with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his head tilted slightly up, and he appeared to be doing exactly what my junior staff member had said, memorizing the hall, not scanning it with any instrument I could see, just standing there, looking, cataloging with his eyes alone. After approximately another 2 minutes, he lowered his head, turned and walked the perimeter of the hall in a slow circuit, touching the wall at irregular intervals, not running his hand along it continuously, but touching specific points. Structural supports, I realized later. He was locating the structural supports by touch. Then he walked back to my junior staff member, thanked her for her time, and asked whether the ventilation shaft above the east wall was accessible from the outside or only from inside the station. She looked it up. She told him it was accessible from inside only. He nodded, said good, and thanked her again and left. I remember thinking that was a very precise question to ask. Not what's the ventilation situation or where are the exits, both standard security questions, but that specific, narrow inquiry about the accessibility of one particular shaft. I looked up the security camera footage afterward. He had spent 11 minutes in the reception hall. During those 11 minutes, by my count, he had identified the 4 main entrance points, the 3 secondary exits, all load-bearing structural elements, the atmospheric processor intake locations, the primary and secondary lighting rigs, the position of every piece of decorative furniture, the sight lines from each entrance to the stage, and apparently the one ventilation shaft that presented a potential external access concern, which he had then confirmed was not, in fact, a concern. In 11 minutes, without a single instrument, with his eyes and his hands. I went back and read the full human Deathworld classification summary that evening, not because I was alarmed, but because I had a professional obligation, I told myself, to be informed about the capabilities of the personnel operating on my station. I read it from the beginning this time, which Senior Attaché Quass apparently had not done. I will not reproduce the full document here. It is available in the standard core cultural briefing file. But I will note that by the time I reached the section on human threat assessment and sensory processing capabilities, I had a glass of water, set it on my desk, and stared at the wall for a few minutes. That section began. Humans evolved in an environment that contained, at various points in their species' history, over 600 distinct predatory threats capable of killing them. As a result, human cognition developed specialized parallel processing channels that allow for simultaneous threat assessment across multiple sensory modalities at speeds that are, by galactic median standards, neurologically anomalous. It then went on for 4 more pages. When I went to sleep that night, I thought, at least he is on our side. And I said our side as if I had already accepted that there was a side and that I had picked one. I suppose I had. Part 4, the first evening. Testimony journalist Sef Endorial, Collective Press Bureau, Helikian Nation. I covered the Solaris Conclave for the Collective Press Bureau. I had been a diplomatic correspondent for 18 years and had covered 11 major galactic summits. I was, to use a human phrase I have recently become fond of, not easily impressed. The opening reception was held in the Grand Reception Hall of Verath Station, which I will describe so that you understand the geography of what follows. The hall is roughly 200 meters long and 80 wide, with a vaulted ceiling 20 meters overhead that has been decorated with an astronomical display, moving star maps of all the member species' home systems, cycling through slowly so that the ceiling appears to breathe with light. The floor is the famous Verath composite, that pale, almost luminous material that seems to glow faintly from within when the overhead lights are dimmed. The walls are hung with the diplomatic flags of all community member species, and along the east wall, there is a raised stage where the ceremonial opening addresses are delivered. It is, in short, a space designed to communicate importance. It does this effectively. The reception began at 1900 station time. The 47 delegations filtered in over the course of about 40 minutes, which is standard practice. You stagger the arrivals to prevent the entrance area from becoming a bottleneck, and you give species with particular environmental sensitivities time to acclimate before the hall fills to capacity. The Corps Honor Guard was stationed at intervals along the perimeter of the room, 2 guards per delegation, with one designated as the primary protective detail for the senior diplomat, and one operating in broader room security capacity. I noticed the human guards simply because they were human, which was still, in year 4412, something of a novelty at events of this scale. There were 2 of them, Corporal Reese with the Vrethian delegation, and a female human corporal whose name I have since learned was Ida Marsh, stationed with the Keth delegation on the far side of the hall. Both were in Corps dress uniform. Both stood in the particular way that human security personnel stand, which is different from how other species security personnel stand, though it took me a moment to identify why. Most guard species stand in a kind of ceremonial stillness, rigid, formal, stationary. They are making a statement about presence and authority through their posture and their immobility. They are saying, I am here and I am powerful, and you should take note of my power by observing how still I hold it. The human guards were not still. They were subtly, continuously moving. Not obviously, not in a way that would draw the eye from across the room, but if you watched closely, you could see it. The weight shifted from foot to foot at irregular intervals. The head turned in tiny increments. The eyes were never fixed. They were always moving, touching different points in the room and moving on. The posture was relaxed at the surface, and I somehow knew without being able to articulate how, not at all relaxed beneath it. They looked less like guards who had been placed in a room, and more like animals who had decided, after assessing the room, that it was safe enough to wait. I wrote that in my notes that evening and then crossed it out because I was not sure it was fair. Looking back, I think it was accurate. Testimony Diplomatic Aide Tires Vor, Keth Concordat Mission. I am Tires Vor. I was the 3rd rank aide in the Keth Concordat delegation, which put me far enough down the seniority ladder that I was spending the reception carrying trays of refreshments and managing the ambassador's social calendar rather than engaging in anything substantive. This meant I was moving around the room more than most of the other attendees, which is why I saw what happened from several different angles. The Keth are a species of roughly 1.4 meters average height, with 4 upper limbs and a broad, flat cranial structure that many other species find visually impressive in a formal setting. We are not, however, known for physical strength or speed. Our homeworld is Kethora, a quiet agricultural world with mild seasons and a predation index of approximately 0.3 on the galactic scale. We are, in the polite formulation, a species shaped more by contemplation than by conflict. I mention this because it matters to understanding my reaction to Corporal Reese when I first had a close encounter with him. I was carrying a tray of refreshments along the east wall of the hall, moving from the service station toward the cluster of dignitaries near the stage, when I rounded one of the decorative pillars and nearly walked directly into him. He was standing approximately half a meter from the pillar's edge, positioned in a way that, I realized, gave him a clear sight line to Ambassador Nassali's location while keeping his own back against the wall. He had placed himself where the pillar provided partial cover at his rear, but did not obstruct his view of the room. He registered my approach perhaps 2 full seconds before I registered his, and he had already shifted his weight to create a clear path for me before I had processed the near collision. The movement was so economical it barely qualified as movement at all. He didn't step aside dramatically. He was simply one moment in one position and the next in another, and the tray never wobbled and neither of us made a sound. "Sorry," he said, quietly enough that only I could hear it. His standard was very clean, almost accent-free, and he said it without looking at me because his eyes had already returned to the room. I moved past him and continued with my task, but for some reason I kept returning to that moment in my head. The speed of his awareness, the efficiency of his adjustment, the way he had made room for me without ever actually looking at me, because looking at me was not what he needed to be doing. I mentioned it to a colleague later that evening, a Vrethian aide I had met at a previous summit, and she laughed and told me that the humans had a phrase for this, situational awareness. She said it like it was a technical term. I asked if it was specific to trained guards or common to all humans. She paused. Then she said, "From what I understand, it is considered a basic survival skill on their homeworld. They all have some version of it." I thought about that for the rest of the evening. Part 5, The Dinner. Testimony Protocol Officer Yessa Lind, Galactic Diplomatic Corps. My role at the conclave was Protocol Officer, which means I was responsible for ensuring that the events unfolded according to the established ceremonial schedule, that the correct courtesies were observed between delegations, and that any logistical disruptions were addressed before they became visible to the attendees. I have held this role at 16 major summits. I am very good at it. The dinner portion of the opening reception began at 2000 station time, when the central tables were uncovered and the delegations were directed to their assigned seats. The seating arrangement had taken 3 weeks to finalize and represented a carefully negotiated balance between status protocols, species compatibility considerations, and several delicate political requirements that I will not enumerate here. Suffice to say that every seat assignment was deliberate and meaningful, and disrupting it would have caused real problems. The guards were not seated, of course. They took position at the perimeter of the dining area, within line of sight of their designated charges but outside the table boundaries. Standard protocol. What was not standard was what happened approximately 40 minutes into the dinner service. The incident began with the Drathic delegation. I should describe the Drathic, because their physical characteristics are relevant to what followed. The Drathic are a large species, the tallest bipedal species in the community, averaging somewhere between 2.6 and 2.9 meters tall, with heavy bone structure and a musculature that reflects their homeworld's high gravity. They are also, by reputation, somewhat aggressive in their interpersonal style, not violent, not by community standards, but assertive in a way that can read as threatening to smaller species. Their ambassador to the Solaris Conclave was a male named Grethak Vassilorn, who was at the upper end of Drathic size, and who had a voice that I had once heard rattle the fixtures in a conference room when he was merely speaking at normal conversational volume. Ambassador Vassilorn had, over the course of the first 40 minutes of dinner, consumed a quantity of the Vrethian ceremonial spirit that was offered as the formal table wine. It is a mild intoxicant by most species standards, and the diplomatic protocol expects senior delegates to accept and drink a quantity of it as a gesture of cultural respect. Ambassador Vassilorn had perhaps interpreted this expectation liberally. He was not, at the point the incident began, what I would describe as intoxicated, but he was perhaps less careful than he would have been sober. The Vrethian delegations table was adjacent to the Drathic delegations table, separated by a decorative centerpiece arrangement and perhaps 2 meters of open floor. Ambassador Nassali was engaged in conversation with her Helikian counterpart when Ambassador Vassilorn pushed back from his chair with sufficient force that it scraped loudly across the floor, attracting the attention of several nearby tables, and rose to his full height. He then turned to face the Vrethian table directly. I do not want to characterize his intentions retrospectively in a way that overstates the situation. He may have simply been standing to stretch. The Drathic find prolonged sitting uncomfortable. He may have been preparing to approach the Vrethian table for a conversation, which would have been unusual protocol but not unprecedented. But he was large. He was standing when everyone else at the nearby tables was seated. His voice when he spoke Ambassador Nassali's name was at a volume that silenced the conversations at 3 nearby tables, and there was something in his posture, the forward lean, the placement of his feet, that activated, I think, the instinctive alarm response in almost everyone within 10 meters. Not everyone. Corporal Reese was already moving. Testimony Ambassador Vreth Nassali, Vrethian Collective Chair, Solaris Conclave. I will tell you what I saw from where I was sitting, and then I will tell you what it meant to me. Ambassador Vassilorn stood. He said my name at a volume that I found startling. I looked up from my conversation. He was approximately 2 meters from where I was seated, and he was very, very large, and something about his posture. I have been in diplomatic service for 400 years, and I have read body language across 40 species, and I will not qualify this. Something about his posture activated in me a response that I had not felt in decades. Something old and animal. The desire to not be where I was. I did not move. I am Ambassador Nassali. I don't flee from dining tables. But I noticed that my fingers had gone to the edge of the table. What I also noticed, in the same instant, was that Corporal Reese was no longer at the perimeter of the room. He was between me and Ambassador Vassilorn. I do not know exactly when he moved. I did not see him move. He was at the perimeter, and then he was not, and the not at the perimeter moment and the Ambassador Vassilorn standing moment were, in my memory, indistinguishable from each other. He moved without the movement registering. He was standing in the gap between the tables, approximately 1 meter from me and 1 meter from Ambassador Vassilorn, and he was not doing anything dramatic. He was not in a defensive stance. He had not drawn the stunner at his hip. He was simply standing there, with his hands loosely at his sides, looking up at Ambassador Vassilorn with an expression that I spent a great deal of time afterward trying to accurately describe. The closest I have come is this. It was the expression of someone who is assessing a situation and has already assessed it, and is now simply waiting to see which of the outcomes they have already mapped will occur. He was not afraid. This was not the forced composure of someone suppressing fear. I know what suppressed fear looks like. I have seen it in every species I have worked with, and I know my own. This was something else. This was a man who looked at something large and aggressive and felt, if he felt anything, interested. Testimony Protocol Officer Yessa Lind, Galactic Diplomatic Corps, continued. I was watching from approximately 8 meters away, near the service entrance, when Corporal Reese materialized, and I am using that word deliberately, because that is what it felt like between the tables. The hall had gone quiet. Not the aggressive silence of a confrontation, not yet, but that particular held-breath quality that descends on a room when something has shifted and no one is quite sure what it is. Ambassador Vassalorn looked down at Corporal Reese. His expression, as I read it, moved through surprise, irritation, and then something that was difficult to categorize. He said, in standard galactic, "Move aside, little one." Several people near me winced. Little one is not technically an insult in Drathic usage. It is simply a size comparative descriptor that Drathic use for smaller species without any intended derogation. But in that moment, in that context, it landed poorly. Corporal Reese did not move. He said, quietly, and the hall was quiet enough that I heard it clearly from 8 meters away, "I don't think that's what either of you wants right now, Ambassador." He said it without any particular emphasis. He didn't stress the word ambassador, which would have been pointed. He didn't say it defiantly. He said it the way you might say something to someone who is about to walk into a door, a simple, neutral statement of fact. Ambassador Vassalorn stared at him for a moment. Then, from somewhere to my left, someone, I have never been able to determine who, made a sound. Not a word exactly, more of an involuntary intake of breath. The kind of sound that happens when a room collectively catches itself. And in that brief moment of silence, in the space between Ambassador Vassalorn's stare and whatever was going to happen next, something occurred that I have replayed in my memory many, many times since, because I am still not completely sure how to interpret it. Ambassador Vassalorn looked at Corporal Reese, not at his face, at him. At his whole posture, the way he was standing, the placement of his feet, the position of his hands. The way a creature looks at another creature when it is performing, at some very deep level, an instinctive assessment. And then, and this is the part I have difficulty with, something changed in the ambassador's posture. Not dramatically, not a step back, not a visible recoil, just a subtle reconfiguration of weight, a slight shift. The kind of adjustment that a very large creature makes when it has, in the deep wordless part of its cognition, registered that the thing in front of it is perhaps not as small as it appears. Part 6. What the room felt. Testimony: Senior Medical Officer Druth Cow, Varath Station, Medical Bay. I am a medical officer, not a diplomat. My expertise is physiological, not political, and I am including my testimony in this file only because Protocol Officer Lind contacted me 3 days after the incident and asked me to explain from a clinical perspective what the witnesses were describing when they reported that the room changed, or something shifted, or the atmosphere became different. I will try to do this in non-technical language. Every species in that room had evolved, to varying degrees, threat assessment systems. These systems operate largely below conscious awareness. They process information about potential dangers, size, movement, posture, sound, chemical signals, and generate instinctive responses that the conscious mind then has to either act on or override. In most galactic species, these systems are relatively limited, because most galactic species evolved in environments with relatively limited threats. You develop the threat assessment capability you need for your environment, and if your environment didn't include many things capable of killing you, you develop a corresponding level of sensitivity. Humans evolved in an environment that was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily dangerous. For most of their evolutionary history, they were not the apex predator. They were medium-sized, relatively slow, not especially strong, not venomous, not armored, and surrounded by things that could and did eat them. Their survival, and ultimately their civilization, depended on an ability to assess and respond to threat that became, over hundreds of thousands of years, extraordinarily refined. What this means in practical terms is that a human who has been trained for close protection work is not merely a trained guard. They are an organism that has been layered by genetics, by development, by training, with multiple redundant systems for detecting and responding to danger, operating simultaneously at speeds that most other species simply cannot match. When Corporal Reese moved into position between Ambassador Nassali and Ambassador Vassalorn, he did so in response to a threat assessment that had been completed before most of the people in that room had registered that there was anything to assess. And when he stood there between the tables, in that specific posture with those specific hands in that specific position, he was not performing danger. He was simply expressing it, a completely natural expression of what he was. Now here is the part that I find most interesting from a clinical perspective. The other species in that room, Vrethian, Helikian, Keth, Drathic, all of them, may have had less sophisticated threat assessment systems than the human, but those systems still existed and were still operating. And what those systems were encountering in Corporal Reese was a signal they were not fully equipped to categorize. He was small by the standards of the room. He was physically unremarkable, but something about the way he occupied that space, the posture, the stillness, the particular quality of his attention was generating, in the subcortical assessment centers of every other conscious creature in that room, a signal that didn't match the visual data. Small but not small. Present but more present than things that size usually are. The Drathic, in particular, are a species with highly developed instinctive threat assessment because they evolved in a competitive environment that required them to accurately rank threats. What Ambassador Vassalorn encountered when he looked at Corporal Reese was a human whose every biological and behavioral signal said, in a language older than any words either of them spoke, "I am not what you think I am. Adjust your assessment accordingly." The shift the witnesses described, that subtle recalibration of the ambassador's posture, that change in the room's atmosphere, was not mysterious. It was, in clinical terms, entirely predictable. It was the moment when the deep and wordless parts of a room full of very different creatures all arrived, within seconds of each other, at the same conclusion. This is a Deathworlder, and a Deathworlder is not smaller than Ambassador Vassalorn. A Deathworlder is simply waiting. Part 7, The Human Side. Testimony: Corporal Davin Reese, Galactic Diplomatic Corps Protective Branch. They put me in a briefing room for 3 hours after the incident. That's standard. Anytime there's a security event, the involved personnel are separated and debriefed individually before they're allowed to compare notes. I sat at the table and answered questions for 3 hours. Then I asked if I was being relieved of my assignment, because I needed to know whether to return to Ambassador Nassali's quarters or report to the Corps billet. The senior interviewer told me I was not being relieved. I said good, then I went back to work. I'm going to tell you what happened from my side, which is different from what the witnesses have described, because they were experiencing something and I was doing something, and those are not the same conversation. I'd been watching Ambassador Vassalorn for about 12 minutes before he stood up. The Corps briefing files on Drathic are thorough, and I'd read them twice before the conclave started. The Drathic are not aggressive as a policy, but they have a very well-developed territorial instinct, and they respond to status challenges with physical escalation that is, in their culture, a completely normal and generally non-lethal form of social management. The problem is that generally non-lethal in Drathic physical terms means something quite different than generally non-lethal in Vrethian physical terms. Ambassador Vassalorn was approximately 2.7 meters tall and massed, by my estimate, somewhere around 300 kilograms. Ambassador Nassali was 1.6 meters tall and probably massed around 60. The force differential involved in even a minimal physical interaction between them would have been significant. I noticed Vassalorn's posture shifting about 12 minutes before he stood. It's hard to explain to someone who doesn't do close protection work. It's not any one thing. It's a change in where the weight is, a change in the pattern of movement, something about the eyes. People who are about to do something physical look different from people who are sitting still, even when they're still sitting. The body is preparing before the mind has finished deciding. You learn to read it. I didn't know he was going to stand up. I knew something was going to happen, and that, whatever it was, I was going to need to be between him and Ambassador Nassali before it completed itself. So I moved. People have asked me about the speed of it. The witnesses say I moved without them seeing it. I moved at a normal walking pace. The reason they didn't see it was that I moved during the half-second when the room's attention had been pulled to Vassalorn standing. Everyone in the room looked at him in that moment, and I used that moment. It's a basic principle. Movement is invisible when attention is elsewhere. What happened when I was standing there between the tables is that I spoke to Ambassador Vassalorn, and then I waited. The witnesses have described this moment as the room going silent or changing. From my side, it was simply a conversation that hadn't started yet. I said what I said. He looked at me. I looked at him. I want to be clear that I was not performing anything. I was not trying to intimidate Ambassador Vassalorn or demonstrate anything to the room. I was simply doing my job, which at that moment consisted of being in a specific location and being, as far as I could manage, exactly what I was. The question people keep asking me is, were you scared? The honest answer is, not in the way you mean. My hands were ready. My weight was in the right position. I had already identified the angle of approach and the response sequence for each of the three most likely scenarios. I was not scared because I was busy. The specific cognitive experience of fear requires a certain amount of unoccupied mental space, and when you are doing close protection work properly, that space doesn't exist. What I felt, if I felt anything, was a version of what I always feel in moments like that. Something like clarity. The world gets very simple. There's the person I'm protecting. There's the thing that might threaten them, and there's the distance between me and both. Everything else goes quiet. People find this impressive for some reason. I find it functional. Ambassador Vassalorn looked at me for approximately 7 seconds. Then he said, in a much lower voice, "You are very small to be so certain of yourself." I said, "I've heard that." He looked at me for another 3 seconds. Then he sat back down. Part 8, The Aftermath. Testimony. Ambassador Vreth Nassali, Vrethian Collective Chair, Solaris Conclave, continued. After Corporal Reese's exchange with Ambassador Vassalorn, there was a pause of approximately 5 seconds in which the entire hall remained in that suspended, held breath quality. Then Ambassador Vassalorn sat down. And then, as if a pressure valve had been released, the hall returned to the sounds of a dinner in progress. I don't think most people in that room could have told you 5 minutes later exactly what had happened. The incident had been so contained, so quiet, so completely resolved before it fully materialized that it resisted easy narrative. What would they say? A guard stepped between two diplomats. Nothing actually occurred. But something had occurred, something small and very large at the same time. Protocol Officer Lind came to find me after the dinner and asked, in her careful, professional way, whether I wished to report the incident formally. I told her it was her call as it was a security matter. She decided to file a documentation report, not a complaint, not an incident flag, just a record of what had happened for the archive. This is that record. I summoned Corporal Reese to my quarters the following morning. I had spent a considerable portion of the previous night reading the full Human Deathworld classification summary. Not the version in the standard core briefing packet, but the complete galactic community scientific assessment, which is classified at a higher level and which I had access to as chair of the conclave. I read it front to back. Then I read the appendix, which is titled Implications for Integrated Service Roles, and which contains, in the careful language of scientific document, a description of what it means to work alongside or be protected by a human. The sentence that stayed with me was this: The human protective instinct, when activated in close proximity service roles, functions less as a professional obligation and more as a fundamental expression of the organism's evolved behavioral repertoire. In practical terms, a human assigned to protect a principal does not decide to protect them. They simply protect them, in the way that breathing is not a decision. I received Corporal Reese in my formal receiving room. He came in, gave the Vrethian formal greeting correctly, without prompting, and stood at ease. I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." He said, "Yes, Ambassador." I said, "Last night, when you stepped between me and Ambassador Vassalorn, were you doing your job, or were you doing something else?" He considered this for a moment. He didn't give me the instant affirmative that most guards would have. He actually thought about it. Then he said, "Both, Ambassador. The job was the permission. The rest of it was just what I am." I looked at him for a while. He looked back. Those medium brown eyes, very steady, very present. I said, "I didn't know where you were born." He said, "Earth Sol System." I said, "I know that now." He waited. I said, "I don't know if I should feel protected or humbled." He said, and I could see in his face that he was not trying to be funny, genuinely trying to answer the question. "Both, probably. That's usually about right." I kept him as my detail for the rest of the conclave. At its conclusion, I personally requested through the Corps that his assignment to the Vrethian collective diplomatic mission be made permanent, if he was willing. He was. Testimony Journalist Sef Endorial, Collective Press Bureau, Helikian Nation. Continued. I filed a report on the opening reception for the Press Bureau that evening. My editor, who was on Helic Prime, asked me if anything interesting had happened. I told him that the Vrethian delegation's human guard had stepped between the ambassador and a Drathic in a way that had briefly turned the room into something like held breath. My editor said, "Sounds like a guard doing their job." I said, "Yes, but the way he did it." My editor said, "Write it up, 300 words." I wrote it up. I wrote 800 words and my editor cut it back to 300. The 300 words that were published are fine. They accurately describe what occurred. But the 500 words that were cut were the ones I actually wanted to write. And since this archive is asking for full testimony, I am going to reproduce the substance of them here. What I saw at the Solaris Conclave was a human standing between a Vrethian and a Drathic in a dining hall on a space station in the neutral ring of the galaxy. And the human was the smallest creature in the immediate vicinity, and the Drathic was one of the largest, and the Vrethian was the most important, and what should have been a simple arithmetic of size and status was instead something else. Something older. The Drathic looked at the human, and the Drathic, who had been gestured by size and nature toward a very particular certainty about how this interaction would resolve, found instead that the certainty did not hold. Not because the human threatened him, not because the human was armed or armored or otherwise conventionally dangerous, but because the human occupied his position with a quality that resisted easy dismissal. An integrity of presence that was not performed, and therefore could not be negotiated with. I have covered 43 years of galactic diplomacy. I have watched species negotiate the balance of power with words, with economics, with historical grievance, with the soft and patient pressure of cultural influence. I had not, until that evening, watched it happen with simply the way a single creature stood in a room. The Third Galactic Compact was signed 11 days after the Solaris Conclave opened. 47 species, 47 signatures. Ambassador Nassali received considerable credit for the successful negotiation, which is appropriate, because she did the actual diplomatic work. But I keep thinking about Corporal Reese standing between the tables, and I keep thinking about the moment the room went quiet, and I keep thinking about what it means that a species has evolved so thoroughly for survival that their most basic professional expression can silence a hall of 47 species without raising its voice. What are they exactly, these humans? I asked one once. Not Corporal Reese, another human I encountered at a different assignment, a xenobiologist named Faris Akawari who worked in the Community Research Division. I asked her what humans were, in her own assessment. She laughed and said, "We're terrified, all the time. We just decided a long time ago that being terrified wasn't a reason not to do things." I thought about that for a very long time. Part 9. The questions the conclave didn't ask out loud. Internal memo. Senior Security Coordinator Ven Harak, Galactic Diplomatic Corps, declassified for this archive. Memo date: 17th of Colturn, UGC 4412, 3 days after the incident. To Director of Protective Services, Galactic Diplomatic Corps. From Senior Coordinator Harak, Neutral Territories Division. Ray Solaris Conclave Security Review, Informal Assessment. I am writing this as an informal assessment rather than a formal review, because what I want to say does not fit comfortably in the boxes of a formal review document. The incident at the opening reception was, by the metrics we use to evaluate incidents, not significant. No one was harmed. No diplomat was touched. The situation was resolved in under 30 seconds. The perpetuating factor, Ambassador Vassalorn's unusual behavior, was addressed the following day through normal diplomatic channels and attributed to an overconsumption of the Vrethian ceremonial spirit, which he apologized for and which the Vrethian delegation accepted graciously. By the numbers, the incident barely exists. But those of us who were in the room know that the numbers are inadequate. I want to document, for the internal record, what I believe actually occurred, because I believe it is operationally significant and I believe we should not pretend otherwise. We assigned a human from a Class 1 Deathworld classification to a routine honor guard rotation at a major diplomatic event. We did this in good conscience, because the human guard met all core standards, had an excellent record, and the assignment was appropriate by every conventional measure. What we did not fully account for is that the standards and measures we use are calibrated to a galactic median, and Corporal Reese, like all humans from a Class 1 Deathworld, is not at that median. When Corporal Reese stepped between Ambassador Nassali and a potential threat, he did not respond to the situation in the way that a guard calibrated to the galactic median would respond. He responded in the way that an organism shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of survival pressure on one of the galaxy's most hostile inhabited worlds responds. He processed the threat faster, moved to intercept before the threat had fully materialized, positioned himself with greater tactical precision, and presented a profile in that position that, and I am trying to find a scientifically precise way to say this, communicated something to the threat assessment systems of every other creature in the room that our conventional guard presence does not communicate. What it communicated was, essentially, this thing has survived things you cannot imagine and it is still here. This is not a criticism of Corporal Reese. On the contrary, it is a recognition of something extraordinary. But it is an operational consideration that I think we have been insufficiently rigorous about acknowledging. When we deploy human guards in close protection roles at major diplomatic events, we are not deploying guards in the conventional sense. We are deploying organisms that have been shaped by an extreme evolutionary environment and then further trained, and the combination of those two things produces a capability profile that is simply different from what we typically field. Not necessarily better in every situation, but categorically distinct. The Drathic Ambassador, one of the most physically imposing and instinctively confident individuals I have encountered in 20 years of this work, looked at a human who massed perhaps 1/8 of his body weight and adjusted his posture. He didn't make a conscious decision. The decision was made for him, by the parts of his neurology that existed before decision-making, that operate below language and culture, that are shared by almost every biological organism that has ever needed to assess another organism's potential to harm. Those parts looked at Corporal Reese and said, "That one is dangerous." Not dangerous for a guard, not dangerous for a human, just dangerous. I am going to recommend, in my formal review, that the Corps consider developing a specific briefing protocol for diplomatic personnel who will be working with human close protection details. Not to alarm them, and not to suggest that human guards are in any way problematic. They are clearly the opposite. But because what happened in that hall, in those 30 seconds, was a demonstration of something that every diplomatic mission in the community should understand. These are Deathworlders, real ones, not the term applied loosely to planets with slightly elevated predation indices. Real ones, the kind shaped by real death, real evolutionary pressure, real hundreds of thousands of years of survival in conditions that would have ended most galactic civilizations before they started. And they are in the community now. They are in our halls. They are guarding our most important people. I believe this is, on balance, an extraordinarily good thing. But I also believe we should see it clearly.